I was sitting at my own Christmas dinner table when my daughter-in-law smiled and told me it was time to leave my house forever. My son lowered his eyes and said nothing. In that moment, something inside me broke far deeper than grief. They thought I was weak, lonely, and too heartbroken to fight back. But when I slowly pulled a $50,000 check from my pocket and tore it in half right in front of them, the entire room fell silent. That was the night everything changed. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're watching from. And as you watch, don't just sit back, be part of the experience. If a moment grabs your attention, whether it's powerful, unexpected, or deeply moving, drop a comment with the timestamp of that scene and share your thoughts. Your reactions bring the story to life, and we love seeing which moments resonate with you the most. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a coffee or tea, settle in, and let's begin. My name is Evelyn Mercer, and at 67 years old, I had finally learned that silence inside a house could feel heavier than grief itself. 8 months had passed since my husband, Theodore, died from a sudden stroke, yet every room in our Carmel by the Sea estate still carried traces of him. His reading glasses remained folded beside the leather chair overlooking the Pacific Ocean. His favorite jazz record still sat beside the antique turntable in the library. Even the scent of cedarwood after the morning fog reminded me of the cologne he wore for almost 40 years. People often imagine grief as loud crying or dramatic loneliness. Mine arrived quietly. It lived in the spaces between ordinary moments, in the empty side of the bed, in the untouched coffee cup beside mine every morning, in the silence that followed me through hallways once filled with conversation and laughter. The house itself sat along the cliffs overlooking the ocean, wrapped in pale stone and weathered cedar shingles. Theodore and I spent decades building our life there. We hosted charity dinners, birthday parties, anniversary celebrations, and every Christmas our family had ever shared. Back then, the estate felt warm and alive. Now, it often felt like a museum dedicated to a life that no longer existed. When my son Ryan asked if he and his wife Vanessa could temporarily move into the guest house behind the property, I agreed without hesitation. Ryan was 38 and struggling after several failed commercial development investments nearly destroyed his architecture firm. Vanessa worked as a lifestyle influencer online, though I privately suspected her glamorous image earned far less money than she pretended. I told myself helping them was what Theodore would have wanted. At first, the arrangement felt manageable. The guest house gave them privacy, while still keeping family close during the difficult months after Theodore's death. But little by little, something inside the house began shifting in ways I could not ignore. Vanessa had opinions about everything. The dining room wallpaper looked dated. The antique furniture felt too heavy. The family portraits made the house resemble an old hotel. She said those things casually, smiling while scrolling through her phone as if criticism were simply part of modern conversation. Then came the Christmas decorations. Every year, Theodore and I decorated the estate together during the first week of December. It had always been sacred to me. But this year, Vanessa took control almost immediately. She replaced the traditional garlands with minimalist white arrangements she had seen online. She reorganized the dining room without asking. She even removed several handmade ornaments Theodore created decades earlier because they did not match the aesthetic. One afternoon, I found one of those ornaments wrapped carelessly inside a storage box in the garage. Ryan noticed it too. He said nothing. That silence hurt more than Vanessa's disrespect ever could. Still, I continued helping them financially. I covered utilities, grocery deliveries, and part of Ryan's car payment. Secretly, I had even prepared a $50,000 Christmas check to help him restart his architecture business after the holidays. Theodore used to warn me about enabling people. Help them stand, he often said. Do not help them stay dependent. I ignored that advice because motherhood softens women in dangerous ways. Late one evening, I stood alone near the ocean-facing windows while rain rolled softly against the glass. Downstairs, Vanessa was filming holiday videos beside my fireplace, laughing into her camera as though the estate belonged to her already. Our Christmas home is finally ready, she said brightly to thousands of strangers online. For the first time in my life, I looked around my own house and quietly wondered whether I had somehow become a guest inside it. 2 days before Christmas, the house no longer felt like mine in the way it once had. The change was subtle enough that an outsider might never have noticed it. Nothing dramatic had happened yet. No screaming arguments, no cruel confrontations. Just a slow, steady erosion of comfort that spread through the estate like coastal fog rolling in from the Pacific. I spent most mornings alone in Theodore's old study overlooking the cliffs. The room still smelled faintly of leather-bound books and sandalwood polish. It was the only place in the house Vanessa had not fully touched yet, though even that seemed temporary now. At breakfast one morning, I overheard her discussing kitchen renovations while scrolling through design photos on her tablet. We could open this entire wall, she said casually. The whole place would feel brighter and more modern. Ryan nodded without looking up from his coffee. Then she laughed softly and added, and honestly, nobody needs a library this large anymore. We could turn it into a media lounge? My stomach tightened. That library had been Theodore's favorite room in the world. I waited for Ryan to object. I waited for him to remind his wife that this was still my home. But he stayed silent, staring into his mug as though disappearing into himself required less effort than defending me. The silence hurt more every day. Vanessa slowly began rearranging pieces of the estate as if ownership had already transferred quietly behind my back. Family photographs vanished from shelves and were replaced with the neutral holiday decorations that looked beautiful on social media but completely lifeless in person. Cabinets were reorganized, storage rooms were relabeled, even the pantry had been transformed into something that looked staged for an expensive cooking channel. One evening, I made the mistake of opening Vanessa's social media account. Video after video showed my home from carefully edited angles. The marble staircase, the ocean view terrace, Theodore's grand piano near the windows. Thousands of strangers online praised Vanessa's dream home and luxury coastal lifestyle. Not once did she mention the woman who actually owned it. I stared at the screen feeling strangely invisible, as though I had somehow faded into the wallpaper of my own life. Part of me tried excusing her behavior. Vanessa grew up differently than I did. Social media rewarded appearances, not gratitude. Ryan's financial troubles had also become impossible to ignore. Late one night, I overheard them arguing in the guesthouse kitchen through the open courtyard window. "We cannot keep living like this," Vanessa snapped. Ryan muttered something too low for me to hear. Then her voice sharpened again. "You need to secure the future before it is too late." I sat frozen in the dark. For the first time, Theodore's old warnings echoed clearly in my mind. Wealth without boundaries destroys families. He used to say it during conversations about distant relatives fighting over inheritances and property disputes. Back then, I believed our family was different. Now, I was no longer sure. The following afternoon, while Vanessa went shopping, I quietly moved important financial records into the private safe hidden behind Theodore's office painting. I also removed old trust documents from my unlocked desk drawer. The motions felt strangely calm, almost instinctive, like some buried survival instinct finally waking up. That evening, Vanessa invited several friends over for wine without asking permission first. As I walked downstairs, I heard laughter drifting through the dining room. Vanessa stood beside the fireplace, holding a glass of white wine while giving everyone a tour. Once we update everything, she said brightly, this place will finally feel modern. The women smiled approvingly. I stood only a few feet away, yet somehow felt entirely absent from the conversation. Ryan saw me near the staircase. Again, he said nothing. That night, I sat alone in Theodore's study, holding the $50,000 Christmas check in my hands. For weeks, I had imagined Ryan's gratitude when I gave it to him. Now I wondered if helping him was no longer kindness at all. Maybe it was simply another way of protecting him from adulthood. As midnight approached, I heard Vanessa speaking softly on the phone downstairs. After the holidays, she whispered, we need to finally have the conversation about getting her out. And for the first time, I realized they were planning a future that no longer included me. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in cold ocean fog and the kind of silence that only expensive houses seem to hold. From the outside, the Mercer estate looked perfect. Warm candlelight glowed through the tall windows overlooking the Pacific, garland wrapped around the staircase banisters. Crystal glasses reflected golden light across the dining room ceiling. Every detail looked elegant enough for a magazine cover. Inside, the house felt hollow. I spent most of the afternoon finishing dinner alone while Vanessa filmed short holiday videos in the living room. Every few minutes, I heard her cheerful voice drifting through the hallway as she adjusted camera angles beside Theodore's grand piano. This lighting is absolutely perfect, she laughed. I said nothing. Theodore used to love Christmas more than anyone I had ever known. He believed holidays were not about decorations or expensive gifts. They were about making people feel safe and wanted. Even during difficult years, he somehow made our home feel warm. This was the first Christmas without him, and somehow I had never felt colder. When dinner finally began, Vanessa controlled the evening like a television producer managing a live event. She rearranged candles twice before sitting down because the symmetry looked wrong in photographs. She stopped Ryan halfway through prayer so she could retake a picture of the table setting. Even the food felt staged rather than shared. Ryan barely spoke during the meal. He looked exhausted, thinner than usual, his shoulders permanently tense from stress he never fully admitted aloud. I knew his financial problems were growing worse. The unpaid debts, the failing business, the expensive image Vanessa constantly tried maintaining online. Yet, despite everything I had done to help them, I still carried one final gift in the pocket of my cardigan. The $50,000 check rested quietly inside a sealed envelope against my chest. Part of me still believed love could fix what had gone wrong inside this family. For a while, the conversation stayed shallow. Vanessa discussed luxury property values along the California coast and spoke enthusiastically about remodeling ideas for the estate. She talked about expanding the kitchen, replacing Theodore's library shelves, and redesigning the outdoor terrace. She spoke as if ownership had already shifted. Ryan kept avoiding my eyes. Then Vanessa carefully placed her wine glass down beside her plate and leaned back in her chair. You know, she said smoothly, Ryan and I have been thinking a lot about the future lately. A strange heaviness settled into my stomach. She continued smiling politely. This house is honestly too large for one person now. Maintaining it alone must be exhausting. I folded my hands quietly in my lap. Vanessa's tone softened into artificial concern. There are some beautiful senior communities closer to Monterey, places with staff and social activities. You would probably be much happier there. The room went completely still. I turned toward Ryan. He stared down at his plate. Not one word. That silence broke something inside me far more deeply than Vanessa's cruelty ever could. Then Vanessa delivered the final blow with astonishing calmness. I really think it is time for you to leave and never return, she said. Ryan and I need space to build our future. For several seconds, nobody moved. Oddly enough, I did not feel anger first. I felt clarity. Years of grief, fear, loneliness, and emotional exhaustion suddenly drained out of me all at once, leaving behind something cold and steady. I realized in that instant that they had mistaken kindness for weakness for far too long. Without speaking, I reached into my cardigan pocket and slowly removed the envelope. Vanessa's eyes immediately brightened. Ryan recognized it instantly. I pulled the check free and held it above the candlelight between my fingers. Then I tore it directly down the center. The ripping sound cut through the dining room like broken glass. Vanessa gasped loudly. Ryan went pale. I calmly tore the pieces once more before placing them on the tablecloth beside the untouched dessert plates. Nobody spoke. I stood, picked up my coat, and walked toward the front door while rain hammered softly against the windows. Behind me, Vanessa finally screamed my name in disbelief, but I never turned around. As I drove along the dark coastline beneath the storm clouds, one terrible truth settled inside me with absolute certainty. Something irreversible had just happened to my family. I spent Christmas night alone in a coastal hotel overlooking the Monterey shoreline. Rain hammered against the balcony windows for hours, and although the room was warm and beautifully furnished, I barely slept at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ryan sitting silently at the dinner table, while Vanessa told me to leave my own home forever. Oddly enough, by morning, the tears had stopped. Something colder had taken their place. I sat beside the hotel window with black coffee and reviewed my finances the same way Theodore used to handle stressful situations. Calmly, methodically, ownership records, utility accounts, access permissions, banking authorizations. As I worked through the details, an uncomfortable realization settled over me. Ryan still had far too much access to my life. I had added him to emergency banking permissions after Theodore died. I covered utility bills automatically every month without thinking about it. I even allowed certain household services to remain under shared access codes for convenience. Convenience suddenly felt dangerous. Theodore always believed grief made people vulnerable. I finally understood what he meant. By late morning, I drove back to the estate. Ocean fog drifted low across the cliffs, making the house appear almost ghost-like from the driveway. The moment I stepped through the front door, Vanessa stormed into the foyer. "Do you have any idea what you destroyed last night?" she snapped. Not my dignity, I thought, but I did not answer aloud. Ryan stood several feet behind her, looking exhausted and pale. He opened his mouth as if preparing to apologize, then closed it again when Vanessa continued speaking over him. "We were trying to help you," she insisted. "You completely overreacted." I looked directly at her for the first time since dinner. What struck me most was not guilt. It was panic. Not over the cruelty of her words, but over the money she believed she had lost. That realization steadied me completely. "You may continue staying in the guest house temporarily," I said calmly, "but the main house is now private. Things are changing starting today." Vanessa stared at me in disbelief. Ryan rubbed his forehead nervously. "Mom, maybe we should all just calm down and talk." "We are talking," I replied quietly. Then I walked upstairs without another word. For the next several hours, I packed away Theodore's watches, family jewelry, trust paperwork, and financial records into locked storage cabinets inside his study. Every item I secured felt symbolic, as though I were reclaiming small pieces of myself that had slowly slipped away over the past year. That afternoon, I made 3 phone calls. First, the locksmith. Second, my private banker. Third, Theodore's longtime estate attorney. I threatened nobody. I raised my voice at no one. I simply began reinforcing the boundaries I should have protected months earlier. The locksmith arrived the following morning. Vanessa nearly exploded the moment she saw him replacing gate codes and interior locks. "This is insane," she shouted from the staircase. "You are acting paranoid." I watched the locksmith calmly install a new deadbolt on Theodore's study. Predators always call boundaries cruelty once they lose access. Ryan remained unusually quiet while I handed him a printed breakdown of guest house utility costs: electricity, water, heating, property maintenance contributions. His expression shifted instantly. "You are charging us now?" he asked softly. "I am asking adults to contribute responsibly," I answered. For the first time since Theodore died, Ryan finally seemed to understand something important. The power inside this family had changed. That night, after the locksmith finished and the final lock clicked securely into place, I sat alone inside Theodore's study with the ocean wind moving softly beyond the windows. And for the first time in many months, the house finally felt safe again. By the middle of January, winter had settled heavily over Carmel by the sea. Cold fog rolled across the cliffs every morning, wrapping the estate in a gray stillness that matched the atmosphere inside the house. Ryan and I barely spoke anymore. Vanessa only approached me when she wanted to complain about utilities, internet speed, or grocery deliveries no longer arriving automatically at the guest house. Silence revealed more truth than arguments ever could. I began noticing changes upstairs almost immediately. Delivery notices piled near the guest house entrance. Expensive packages stopped arriving. Vanessa quietly disappeared from social events she once posted online almost daily. One afternoon, I noticed she was no longer wearing the diamond bracelet she had proudly shown off during Christmas videos. Another week later, her designer handbags vanished too. Yet online, her life still appeared flawless. Every evening she continued posting carefully edited videos showing expensive wine, luxury candles, ocean sunsets, and inspirational captions about gratitude and success. Thousands of strangers still admired the glamorous illusion she built around herself. But real life was beginning to crack underneath it. One rainy afternoon, my private banker called unexpectedly. His tone remained professional, but cautious. "Mrs. Mercer," he said gently, "I wanted to verify whether you personally authorized several recent business-related credit inquiries connected to your estate address." My stomach tightened instantly. I had authorized nothing. Within an hour, I learned Vanessa had used the Mercer estate address for multiple influencer business accounts, luxury financing applications, and short-term commercial credit lines. Several balances were already overdue. Although the accounts were not legally under my name, the association with the estate could still create serious complications if lawsuits or liens followed. I sat alone in Theodore's study staring at the paperwork spread across the desk. For the first time, I no longer felt merely disrespected. I felt exploited. Theodore's old warnings echoed painfully in my mind. Wealth without boundaries destroys families. I used to believe he sounded overly cautious. Now I realized he had simply lived long enough to understand human nature better than I did. The following week, Theodore's attorney connected me with a forensic accountant who quietly reviewed Ryan and Vanessa's finances. What he uncovered left me shaken. Ryan's architecture business was drowning in debt. Outstanding loans exceeded $100,000. Several vendors had stopped working with him entirely. Vanessa's luxury lifestyle online was funded almost completely through borrowed money and unpaid balances. None of it had ever been sustainable. The truth became impossible to ignore. They were never rebuilding independently in the guest house. They were waiting for me to weaken emotionally, waiting for control of the estate, waiting for inheritance to solve problems discipline never could. One evening, heard a vicious argument drifting across the courtyard from the guest house kitchen. "You were supposed to handle this," Vanessa hissed. Ryan snapped back with more anger than I had heard from him in years. "Maybe if you stopped spending money, we do not have, none of this would be happening. Vanessa's voice turned sharper. We would not be in this position if you had secured the house already. The words hit me harder than I expected. So that was the plan all along. A few days later, the final piece fell into place. I learned Vanessa had secretly invited a luxury realtor to tour the estate weeks before Christmas. The realtor believed Ryan and Vanessa were preparing for future refinancing discussions once ownership transferred within the family. The Christmas dinner conversation had not been emotional or impulsive. It had been strategic. That realization devastated me more deeply than the insult itself. Late one night, Ryan finally knocked quietly on Theodore's study door. He looked exhausted, hollow, almost defeated. For the first time, he admitted the collectors would not stop calling. He admitted the debts were crushing him. Then he looked at me with the same helpless expression he carried as a child, waiting for rescue. And sitting there in the silence, I realized the next choice I made would determine whether my son finally became a man or remained dependent forever. I did not sleep at all after Ryan confessed the truth about his debts. The entire night I sat awake in Theodore's study, listening to the ocean crashing against the cliffs below the estate. Every memory of Ryan's childhood drifted through my mind in painful fragments. His first school concert, the afternoons Theodore spent teaching him architectural sketching at the kitchen table, the shy smile he used to have whenever he wanted approval. Ryan had always been soft-hearted, but he had also spent his entire life avoiding conflict and consequences whenever possible. Theodore warned me about that years ago. He believed too much protection could quietly weaken a person. I never wanted to hear it. Mothers convince themselves that love means removing pain from their children's lives. Now I understood how dangerous that belief could become. The following morning, Ryan entered the kitchen alone while I prepared tea beside the stove. He looked exhausted, unshaven, and emotionally hollow. Vanessa was nowhere in sight, probably asleep after another night of arguments upstairs. For several minutes, Ryan simply stood there in silence. Then everything finally came pouring out. The business accounts were collapsing. Credit cards had reached their limits. Collection agencies were calling daily. Investors were threatening legal action. Vanessa's social media income had dropped dramatically, yet the spending never stopped. We are drowning, he admitted quietly. I listened without interrupting. What struck me most was not the debt itself. It was the way Ryan described it all, like weather happening to him, rather than choices he had made. Every sentence carried exhaustion, fear, and helplessness, but very little responsibility. Eventually, he sat across from me at the kitchen island and lowered his voice. I just need enough help to stabilize things, he said carefully. Maybe $120,000, just temporarily. The number settled heavily into the room. For one terrible moment, every instinct inside me wanted to save him. I wanted to erase his fear the same way I had done throughout his entire life. I understood suddenly how easy it would be to refinance part of the estate, write a check, and make the problem disappear for a while. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Nothing would actually change. I looked at Ryan quietly and asked the only question that mattered. If I give you this money, what exactly becomes different afterward? He opened his mouth, then hesitated. There was no real answer, only desperation. Ryan's expression slowly hardened. Dad would have helped me, he said. Family is supposed to protect each other. The words cut deeply because part of me still feared they were true, but the Theodore had also believed something equally important. Protecting someone from every consequence eventually destroys their ability to stand alone. I will not refinance this estate, I said calmly, and I will not become responsible for debts I did not create. Ryan stared at me like a stranger. You have become cold, he whispered. No, I had simply stopped sacrificing myself to keep other people comfortable. Ryan left the kitchen furious and emotionally shattered. The moment the door closed behind him, I finally cried. Not because I doubted my decision, but because motherhood sometimes demands heartbreak no one prepares you for. Later that afternoon, I met Theodore's estate attorney in Monterey. He explained something Theodore had arranged years earlier without ever fully discussing it with me. The Mercer Family Trust contains specific protections against elder financial abuse, forced refinancing, and manipulative guardianship attempts. Then the attorney said something I never forgot. Theodore trusted your kindness, he told me gently. He worried someone might eventually abuse it. That evening I returned home just before sunset. Ryan sat alone outside the guest house, staring silently toward the ocean. And for the first time in years, I realized losing access to rescue might finally force my son to confront the man he had become. If you are still watching and wondering whether losing everything might finally force someone to grow up, comment number 6 below, so I know you are ready for Chapter 7. The emotional fallout is only getting deeper from here. By early March, the storms along the California coast had finally begun to ease. Sunlight returned in brief stretches during the afternoons, but the atmosphere around the estate still felt heavy and exhausted, like a family holding its breath after months of damage no one could fully repair. The guest house no longer resembled the glamorous little paradise Vanessa once showed online. The delivery boxes stopped arriving. Expensive flower arrangements disappeared from the patio. Grocery orders became smaller and less frequent. At night, arguments drifted through the courtyard often enough, that I stopped pretending not to hear them. Financial pressure strips people down to their true character eventually. Vanessa's online world had also started collapsing. I noticed fewer sponsored posts and fewer luxury restaurant photos appearing on her accounts. Some followers openly questioned why she kept filming old content repeatedly. Others pointed out that her perfect life looked strangely staged lately. Still, Vanessa refused to let the illusion die. One afternoon, I watched from the kitchen window as she filmed the same glass of champagne from 3 different angles near the guest house patio. 10 minutes later, she changed outfits and filmed it again, as though it were a completely different evening. The desperation behind it all saddened me more than I expected. Ryan looked worse every week. His expensive car was gone now, repossessed after months of missed payments. I began noticing him waiting for the city bus near the highway most mornings before sunrise. One rainy afternoon, I saw him sitting alone at the stop with his coat pulled tightly around himself while cold wind blew across the road. For a moment, my heart nearly broke. No matter what had happened between us, he was still my son. But Theodore once told me something I never truly understood until then. Guilt is not the same thing as responsibility. Feeling pain for someone does not mean sacrificing yourself to remove every consequence from their life. Inside the guest house, the marriage itself seemed to be crumbling. Vanessa blamed Ryan constantly now. Sometimes I overheard fragments through the open courtyard windows. She accused him of ruining their future, losing opportunities, and failing to secure the estate before everything spiraled out of control. What surprised me most was Ryan no longer defending her the way he once did. Something inside him was changing slowly. Meanwhile, pieces of my own life quietly began returning. I started attending local art events again in Carmel by the Sea. For the first time since Theodore died, I allowed myself to sit in crowded rooms without feeling guilty for surviving him. At a small fundraiser for the Community Arts Center, I reconnected with Daniel Brooks, a retired art history professor I had met years earlier through Theodore. Daniel was 70, widowed, thoughtful, and wonderfully calm. He spoke to me normally, without pity or awkward sympathy. Our conversations felt peaceful in a way I had forgotten was possible. One afternoon, Vanessa saw me leaving for coffee with him. Her expression hardened immediately. "It seems a little fast for this kind of social life," she remarked coldly. Months earlier, that comment might have filled me with shame. Now I simply smiled politely and kept walking. That evening, Ryan approached me quietly near the garden, overlooking the ocean cliffs. He looked exhausted, older somehow. For several moments he stared at the waves before speaking. "I should have stopped her that night at Christmas," he admitted softly. "I knew she was wrong. I was just scared." The apology did not erase the damage, but for the first time in many months, I heard honesty in my son's voice instead of entitlement. After he walked away, I remained beside the garden alone, watching the sunset burn across the Pacific horizon. And quietly, I realized something important. Sometimes healing only begins after every illusion finally falls apart. By April, spring had finally settled along the California coast. The heavy winter fog lifted earlier each morning, and sunlight once again spilled across the cliffs surrounding the estate. For the first time in nearly a year, the property felt lighter somehow, as though the house itself had grown tired of carrying tension. Peace, I discovered, rarely arrives dramatically. Most of the time, it enters quietly. Ryan and Vanessa barely spoke to each other anymore. The constant fighting had faded into cold silence instead, which somehow felt even sadder. Vanessa spent most of her time isolated inside the guest house, scrolling endlessly through her phone or leaving for hours without explanation. Ryan, meanwhile, had started taking temporary design contracts in nearby towns. He left early every morning carrying a worn leather portfolio instead of the expensive confidence he once performed so easily. I noticed other changes too. He stopped ordering unnecessary things online. He cooked simple meals. He even began taking responsibility for the utility payments without reminders. Small things perhaps, but real maturity often reveals itself quietly. Still, I knew the arrangement could not continue forever. One afternoon, I met with contractors about renovating the guest house once Ryan and Vanessa moved out. I planned to convert it into a small artist residency connected to the local arts community in Carmel by the Sea. Daniel Brooks joined me for coffee afterward and helped review renovation sketches spread across the patio table. "You finally sound excited about the future again," he observed gently. The comment stayed with me long after he left. For months, my entire emotional world had revolved around surviving betrayal, grief, and conflict. Now, for the first time, I was beginning to imagine a life centered around something else entirely. Myself. That evening, Ryan knocked quietly on the kitchen door and asked if we could talk privately. He looked calmer than I had seen him in months. He explained that he and Vanessa had found a small apartment closer to the city. Vanessa recently accepted a lower-paying marketing position, and Ryan believed they could manage if they lived carefully. "We will be out by the end of the month," he said softly. Relief washed through me first, then sadness, because despite everything that happened, part of me still mourned the family I thought we once were. Ryan apologized again that night, but this time his words sounded different, less desperate, less defensive. He admitted he had relied on me emotionally and financially for far too long. He admitted fear had made him weak. "I kept choosing comfort over integrity," he confessed quietly. I listened without interrupting. Finally, I told him the truth as gently as I could. "Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, Ryan. I can forgive you and still need boundaries." He nodded slowly without arguing. That alone told me how much he had changed. Vanessa reacted differently to the move. One morning, I overheard her angrily blaming me for destroying their future. But her bitterness no longer reached inside me the way it once had. People who build their lives around entitlement often mistake boundaries for betrayal. Moving day arrived quietly. Ryan loaded boxes into a small rental truck while Vanessa avoided eye contact completely. Before leaving, Ryan walked toward me near the driveway and thanked me sincerely for everything I had done for him throughout his life. For the first time in years, he sounded like a man instead of a frightened child asking to be rescued. After the truck disappeared down the coastal road, I walked alone through the empty guest house. I opened every window and let the ocean air sweep through the rooms. The stale emotional weight finally left with it. Standing there in the sunlight, I realized something profound. I was no longer rebuilding after loss. I was finally building a life that belonged entirely to me. If you are still watching and waiting to see whether healing and justice can truly exist together, comment number 8 below to stay with me until the final outcome of the story. The ending carries a lesson you will not forget. By early summer, the Mercer estate finally felt alive again. Not loud, not crowded, just peaceful in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. The guest house renovation had been completed only a few weeks earlier, and sunlight now poured through the large coastal windows onto pale hardwood floors and freshly painted walls. What once carried tension and resentment had transformed into something warm and creative. I converted part of the space into a small art studio for local workshops, mostly attended by women around my age who were rebuilding their lives after divorce, loss, or years spent caring for everyone except themselves. I understood those women more than I ever expected to. For so long, my identity revolved around being needed. Theodore's wife, Ryan's mother, the dependable woman who always fixed problems before anyone else even noticed them. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that I existed outside of sacrifice. Now, slowly, I was remembering. Daniel Brooks became a steady presence during those months. We spent quiet afternoons walking along the Carmel shoreline, visiting small galleries or drinking coffee while discussing books Theodore once loved. Nothing about our connection felt rushed or dramatic. That was what made it meaningful. Daniel never tried to rescue me, and he never treated me like someone fragile. He simply saw me clearly. Ryan visited occasionally after moving into the city apartment. Our conversations remained careful but respectful. Trust, I had learned, does not instantly repair itself simply because apologies are spoken aloud. Still, I could see real changes in him. One afternoon, he stood quietly inside the renovated guest house, looking around with visible emotion in his eyes. "I never appreciated what you and Dad built," he admitted softly. "I thought stability was something I automatically deserved." The honesty in his voice felt painfully genuine. Then he surprised me even more. "You were right not to save me," he said. "Losing everything comfortable forced me to finally grow up." Hearing those words brought both sadness and pride at the same time. Before leaving, Ryan admitted he and Vanessa were separating temporarily. Once the money disappeared, the illusion holding their marriage together began collapsing too. I felt compassion for him, but no urge to interfere. Some people know how to love comfort more easily than they know how to love sacrifice. A few nights later, I hosted a small sunset gathering for my art workshop group on the terrace overlooking the Pacific. Soft lights glowed along the railing while ocean waves crashed below the cliffs. Daniel helped arrange flowers near the tables while laughter drifted gently through the evening air. Standing there beneath the fading sunlight, I realized something profound. Protecting my boundaries had not destroyed my life. It had saved it. Later that night, after everyone left, I stood alone facing the dark ocean horizon. For the first time in years, the future no longer felt frightening to me. It felt open. By the middle of summer, peace no longer felt unfamiliar inside the Mercer estate. It felt permanent. The guest house had become a thriving artist residency filled with sunlight, music, and women rediscovering themselves after years spent sacrificing their identities for everyone else. Sometimes I listened to their conversations drifting through the garden and realized how many of us had quietly mistaken exhaustion for love. Daniel remained a steady part of my life. Nothing dramatic, nothing overwhelming, just peaceful companionship built through shared routines, long conversations, and quiet evenings overlooking the Pacific Ocean. After years of emotional tension, I finally understood something important. Healthy love feels calm. One afternoon, Ryan visited carrying a large legal envelope from Theodore's attorney. Inside were finalized trust documents I had never fully reviewed myself. Theodore had designed the Mercer family trust carefully years earlier, long before any of this happened. Ryan explained the final clause quietly. He could only access his full inheritance after maintaining complete financial independence for 5 consecutive years without relying on me financially. At first, Ryan admitted he felt angry reading it. Then he gave a tired smile and said softly, "Dad understood me better than I understood myself." For a moment, emotion caught painfully in my throat. Even after death, Theodore had still been protecting both of us. Ryan also told me he and Vanessa officially separated. Once the money disappeared, so did the illusion holding their marriage together. Oddly enough, I felt no bitterness anymore. Some people love comfort more than partnership. Before leaving, Ryan thanked me one final time, not for rescuing him, for refusing to. That evening, I walked slowly through the estate alone while warm ocean wind moved through the garden roses. The house no longer felt haunted by grief or tension. It finally felt lived in again. Standing beside the cliffs overlooking the Pacific, I realized the most important lesson of my entire life. Kindness without boundaries becomes self-destruction, but boundaries without bitterness become freedom. Some wounds do not heal through revenge. They heal the moment we stop abandoning ourselves to keep others comfortable. Life has a quiet way of teaching that love without respect eventually becomes sacrifice, and sacrifice without boundaries slowly destroys the soul. Sometimes losing the illusion of family, comfort, or security becomes the very thing that leads us back to peace. The hardest lesson is understanding that protecting your heart does not make you cruel. It makes you wise enough to survive. And in the end, true freedom begins the moment you stop living by fear, guilt, or the expectations of others, and finally choose yourself without apology. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone in your life, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and follow the channel for more emotional family stories and meaningful life lessons.